Hello and welcome to Origin Story. In each episode, we take an idea, figure or event from history, we explain its origins, and then we talk about how it influences political discourse today. I'm Dorian Linsky, author of 33 Revolutions Per Minute.
And I'm Ian Dunt, currently freaked out by you delving deeper into your book back catalogue when you introduce yourself.
Just trying to shake things up. So this is part two of The New Left. And part one talked about how it starts with the events of 1956 in the Soviet Union and the invasion of Hungary and people looking for a form of socialism that is not tied to Moscow. We talked about how these intellectuals like Herbert Marcuse and C. Wright Mills diagnosed the American empire, American society as fundamentally rotten and in need of redemption. And looking beyond the Marxist obsession with class struggle to an alliance of students, workers to some degree, minorities, and third world independence struggles. The word, I suppose, is like liberation in all of these different senses. And therefore, they turn to people like Mao Zedong, Che Guevara, Ho Chi Minh, Frantz Fanon, who all talk about and in most of those cases carry out revolutionary guerrilla violence against imperial force. And also talked about how things were getting pretty fractious by the end of 1967. And everything taking a bit of a darker turn. So the academic year 1967 to 68 is the peak of the New Left as a political force. There are whole books about the protests of 1968. In Paris, London, Bonn, New York, Tokyo, Stockholm, Madrid, Rome, Buenos Aires, Rio de Janeiro, Mexico City, Warsaw, Prague. You've got people revolting against democracies, communist dictatorships, military juntas.
It's funny, isn't it? Because, during the Marx episodes, we had that 1848 kind of moment, right, where you just see these revolutions sweep over and just that sense of like in a very, very, restricted period of time, country after country undergoing this turmoil. And 68 is probably the closest approximation towards that.
Well, because it's global. A British Trotskyist called Chris Harman said, 1968 is a year of international revolution, no less than 1793, 1830, 1848, 1917, and 1936. We are experiencing the rebirth of the international Marxist movement after over 30 years of defeat and hibernation. It's the first such year to be televised.
Oh, God, of course.
So when protesters were beaten by Chicago police at the Democratic National Convention in August, they chanted, "The whole world is watching."
Yeah.
Which could kind of be a mantra for the whole year. And it was a remarkable thing. We could have done a season on 1968, right?
Oh, God, easily.
The assassinations of Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy, the Rivers of Blood speech, the start of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, the Democratic National Convention, the Mexico Olympics. We'll come to the Prague Spring and the invasion of Czechoslovakia later in the season. So for this bit, I'm going to focus on the sort of student uprisings in the West, because that is, I suppose, just trying to impose some more coherent narrative on things.
Yeah.
The feminist socialist Sheila Rowbotham said, there was too much to absorb. You couldn't believe your own ears sometimes. Nothing seemed impossible. It is an incredibly exciting period to read about. So let's get out of the Anglosphere a little bit.
Oh, good. We're going to Paris. Where are we going?
We're going to go to Germany first.
Germany.
So, crucial thing about the New Left is it's into participatory democracy and radical egalitarianism. Don't follow leaders, watch your parking meters, as Bob Dylan said. Opposed to the discipline and bureaucracy of the full-on Maoists and Trotskyists. They were still very much into centralized control. They were practicing what Lenin once described as left-wing communism, an infantile disorder.
Oh, yes, of course.
It lacks discipline. So it doesn't have leaders per se, but it has celebrities who kind of become leaders. So, for example, in Britain, Tariq Ali was called the leader of British students, even though he was no longer actually a student.
Right.
But he was a charismatic orator, and he becomes like the sort of focus. In Germany, that was Rudi Dutschke, born in East Germany in 1940, moved to West Germany days before the Berlin Wall went up. Are you familiar with Rudi Dutschke?
No.
Fascinating character. He was in the Socialist German Students' League, which was a branch of the Social Democrats, I suppose the equivalent of Labour students.
Right.
The Social Democrats, the SPD, keep coming up in the story, right?
Yeah.
Incredibly important party throughout.
We annoyingly haven't focused on them, but and so, during the Labour story,
Yeah.
the SPD and Labour have a sort of weirdly echoing relationship. They tend to veer off to the left at the same time, moderate at the same time. They're quite intimately twinned in their dynamics.
They're the kind of basically leaders of European Marxism, until Lenin rises. It's an incredibly important party. So Germany has a lot of the same issues as other countries in the 60s, but the twist is that the Social Democrats and the Christian Democrats, the Conservatives, form a grand coalition in 1966, which outrages the left, much like the UK's national government in 1931.
Right.
So it creates this democratic deficit. It's almost like there's no opposition. So Dutschke pulls ideas from all over, from Mao, the Frankfurt School, Rosa Luxemburg, the Situationists, even Christianity. He was a Christian socialist. So he believed in third worldism and direct democracy, also patriotic socialism. He was a proper thinker, actually, of these activists. And in Europe, there was a lot of so-called exemplary action where you model a different society in miniature through communes, squats, occupations, etc. A lot of these flamed out, perhaps inevitably. Dutschke was thinking more long-term. He came up with a phrase which is often misattributed to Gramsci, the long march through the institutions.
Oh, no shit. That's him.
It's derived from Mao's long march during his very long guerrilla war against the Chinese nationalists. And what he meant was that the left should become teachers, journalists, lawyers, politicians, and so on. This is crucial in the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, where it is considered a form of pernicious infiltration.
Right.
You could say this is called politics.
Yeah, of course.
This is called just influencing civil society. Yes. It's fine. In April 1968, inspired by the murder of Martin Luther King, a neo-Nazi shoots Dutschke in the head. He survives for another decade, but never fully recovers. Has a really horrible death, where I believe he has a stroke related to his head injury while in the bath and drowns in the bath.
No, poor guy.
That assassin did kill him, but a decade later. And his death sparks protests and occupations in West Berlin and Paris. So remember Marcuse, I said, stayed in America while Adorno went back to Frankfurt. So there's a split in the Frankfurt School. They fall out over the student protests in Germany. So Adorno tells his students, it's very centrist of him, not to make the mistake of attacking what was a democracy, however much in need of improvement, rather than tackling its enemy. And called the cops when students occupied his office. And Adorno's colleague, Jürgen Habermas, said that Dutschke really represented left fascism.
Oh, wow.
Which is very early, sort of like anti-woke hyperbole, I guess, isn't it? Paris, meanwhile, synonymous with the 1968 protests. Months of student unrest explode in May when students marching on the Sorbonne clash with riot police and they build barricades. I mean, this is so many movies, so many books. It's so mythologized. Paris's answer to Rudi Dutschke was a 23-year-old French-German student, Daniel Cohn-Bendit, who said he was not the leader but the megaphone of the movement. He said, "I am a media creation." He was actually a libertarian more than anything. Not a Marxist, not actually a great thinker. He said the May movement is not to the left of the Communist Party, but ahead of it. It belongs to the next generation.
Oh, wow. He sounds like Tony Blair.
Not left, not right, not up,
forward.
not down, but forward. I mean, what's that mean? It just means there's a lot of young people. So a few weeks, the protests turned parts of the city into these self-governing horizontal societies.
It's almost like the return of the Paris Commune, right?
Absolutely. Particularly in the Latin Quarter. There's this spontaneous ethos. It's summed up by the graffiti. And all these magazines that come out, they last for a single issue. Slogans like, dreams are reality, be realistic, demand the impossible.
Yeah.
I mean, this is the imagery of I would say Paris more than anywhere else is the image of 68. There's all these action committees, citizens' assemblies, modeling direct democracy, lots of wonderful experiments over really a very short space of time. Now, at first, this was backed by a general strike, but the students didn't have the old left on their side. They were speaking different languages. The communists called them false revolutionaries, practicing extremist infantilism. That Lenin criticism again. And the trade unions made a deal with President de Gaulle.
Extremist infantilism is a top phrase.
It's
I would
great
love
insult.
to be accused of that.
So de Gaulle was quite clever. He didn't really know how to deal with the students, but he did know how to deal with the unions. Like, that was a world that he understood.
Right.
So he makes deal with them, ends the strike. Also, there's some chicanery where he calls an election and he ends up basically reasserting his control.
This all sounds terribly de Gaulle.
I mean, very, very cunning, dastardly cunning. Cohn-Bendit had said initially, we will set up the barricades and the workers will find their own way to them. But the workers did not. He then wrote a book very quickly saying how useless the unions were. And you get this everywhere, this notion of a worker-student alliance. The Maoists were like, okay, we're going to go into factories and we're going to, take jobs in factories. And while we're there, we're going to lecture the workers about Maoism. And they returned disappointed, going, people don't seem to be into this at all.
Right. That dream of it happening is almost like what's at the heart of like a film like Pride, for those very short moments in the 80s where you do get sort of like much more kind of radical identity-based sort of politics actually cooperating with workers' politics. But it's very, very, very rare that happens. So rare, in fact, that you end up making films about it.
That's a great point. Pride is kind of like a movie about what the New Left wanted to be, building these alliances. Yeah. Italian students tried to get workers at the Pirelli factory in Milan to stage an occupation, and the workers went, why would we occupy a place that we hate? We don't want to be here. Like a strike, great. An occupation? So there is a failure of communication between the students and the workers. Britain, relatively tame by comparison. We talk about the Grosvenor Square anti-war protest in spring 68, which inspires the Rolling Stones song Street Fighting Man. There are protests, there are sit-ins. If you remember from the Labour episodes, this is when Tony Benn went along to one and got radicalised by the New Left and began his obsession with grassroots politics.
Right.
Michael Rosen and Christopher Hitchens were two of the people in the student vanguard. I think they were at university at the same time, actually. I think they were like mates.
Okay.
So there's a group called the Revolutionary Student Socialist Federation, which has a manifesto.
You're not going to give us the acronym, are you?
They're never going to appear again in history. And it says, the group commits itself to the revolutionary overthrow of capitalism and imperialism and its replacement by workers' power, and bases itself on the recognition that the only social class in industrial countries capable of making the revolution is the working class, which is extremely old Marxist, right?
Yeah.
In the meantime, they're calling for the abolition of all exams. Yay! And an end to bourgeois ideology masquerading as education.
Okay.
So it's like they've got this kind of grand idea that they're going to lead an old-fashioned workers' revolution, but in the meantime, exams are bullshit. Mostly this involves endless meetings and bitter factional splits.
Sure.
So, America. During this academic year, there were 3,463 student protests in America. It is a remarkable number. The SDS triples in size, but this actually weakens it because it doesn't have a proper organization. So Todd Gitlin of the SDS, who I quoted in the last episode, he says its big mistake was resisting explicit programs and organizational discipline to the point where hardline Marxists step in and fill the void.
Right.
You can't get away with not giving people a program. So there's a split between the militant action faction and the more moderate praxis axis.
Are you fucking serious right now? Incredible.
I love that. The action faction and the praxis axis. So the action faction...
It's like CBBC invented communist politics.
The action faction wins the chairmanship of the SDS, the guy called Mark Rudd, who leads the occupation at Columbia University, which is the most famous student protest in America in 68. Tom Hayden, remember, a more, I would not say more moderate in his tactics, but still radical in his ambitions, called Rudd, committed to revolutionary destruction, sarcastic and smugly dogmatic.
Right.
Did not take to this new. And again, Hayden, he's a student in 1962. This is now 68. He's not the young guy anymore.
Yeah.
And the young guys are freaking him out. Then this firebrand called Bernadine Dawn is elected as part of the SDS leadership. Asked if she was really a socialist, she said, I consider myself a revolutionary communist. So it's all gone quite hardline, and in some ways quite backward.
Yes.
So 1968 overall was an explosion rather than a plan. There was no way to exploit that momentum. It kind of fizzles out. You don't have the leaders. You don't have the structures. You've got too many factions and disputes. So there's this famous trial of the Chicago 7 that follows the Democratic National Convention protests.
There was a recent film, which was quite fun. It was good.
And 7 of the New Left leaders are charged with conspiracy, including Tom Hayden, and 2 of the Yippies, Jerry Rubin and Abby Hoffman. And during the trial, he's asked about this conspiracy, and he basically sums up the New Left with the line, "We couldn't agree on lunch." And they were indeed acquitted of conspiracy, because people were like, there's no way these guys managed to agree on anything. Again, the problem of the workers, the average American. By 1970, most Americans saw campus unrest as America's biggest problem, bigger than crime, poverty, or Vietnam. In one 1968 poll, 78% of working class Berliners under 30 opposed student violence. I mean, these are meant to be your people, the young working class. Here's Todd Gitlin again. We were hated. We were seen, not inaccurately, as part of a radical ensemble that really wanted to turn a great deal upside down. Most of the country didn't want to have that much turned upside down.
Yeah.
Very clear-sighted about when you're in the thick of a movement, you're just like, it's so exciting. We're so right. Everyone will follow us. And then they're just like, why do people hate us?
Well, it's also, the strange thing is, right, that the stuff that they're talking about, anti-imperialism, obviously it makes complete sense for why that's being discussed at this point. You know, when you look at the way that France has been behaving in Vietnam and Algeria, when you look at the way the US is behaving in Vietnam or all over Latin America.
Sure.
You know, this is the peak of US imperialism, of that kind of colonialist mentality in Europe. And yet that isn't really connected to what's going on economically in people's lives.
No.
Economically in people's lives, it's really, you've never had it so good time. You know what I mean? Like, now you have washing machine. Just consider for a moment what the washing machine does to liberate women.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and it's almost always women, from just the drudgery that life was composed of, let alone when you start thinking about why the car liberates people from, you know, their local, from their town, from their family, fills them full of a sense of freedom. So that material change is allowing people's lives to blossom in a way it hadn't before. So fine, the argument that you're doing on imperialism, very strong, very pertinent. When you try to make that a workers' argument, look at how you oppress, it's like there's not a huge audience for that, because this is the period where the economics are working really very well indeed.
Well, they don't agree with Marcuse that, you know, America is a rotten, irredeemable society. And if they do think there's problems in America, they think it is the students. They think it is black power. They think it's the protesters that are causing the problems. And in fact, what is coming, of course, is a massive right-wing backlash. And the Nixon years.
Yes.
So to quote the Stooges, it's 1969, okay, war across the USA. They were literally just describing what was happening. 13% of students describe themselves as either revolutionary or radically dissident. Some believe America is on the verge of collapse. The only way to end the Vietnam War, end racism, redeem America is a revolution. SDS member Kirkpatrick Sale says, rather nicely, the feeling was a blend of bitterness, hatred, and alienation, hope, confidence, and conviction, energy, passion, and need. So this quite kind of incoherent, apocalyptic mood that like something must change. Now we can look back and go, well, look, that moment had gone. It was 1968, right? But there was a great revolutionary energy. Hi, I'm Dorian Linsky from Origin Story.
And I'm Ian Dunt.
This ad is brought to you by Incogni. So during this season, we've talked a bit about surveillance, from Stalin's secret police to the FBI infiltrating left-wing groups. These days, unless you've done something bad, you're probably not the subject of a secret dossier, but your data is constantly being sold or published online without your knowledge by data brokers. This can lead to spam, scams, all the way up to identity theft and harassment. I regularly get emails from companies I've never heard of who seem to know an awful lot about me, and it's not because they love Origin Story. I try to talk to them about Marxism, Leninism, and Gramsci's prison notebooks, and they go very quiet.
I sort of have this like abiding fear that no one is trying to steal my identity because nobody wants it. But I hear that it's like a significant danger for everybody else.
They're not that picky. You have every right to demand that these data brokers delete the information they hold about you, but it's a giant headache to do it on your own. Not only do you have to make scores of individual requests, you have to make them again every time the data brokers build up new records of your information.
So the way it works is that they just do all the work for you, just working in the background to make sure that your name is eradicated from the internet on a day-by-day basis.
You create an account and you license them to contact data brokers on your behalf. For me, they found 47 brokers who had my info. They contacted them all with removal requests. And it tells you how long it would have taken you to do all this on your own. In my case, 26 hours.
I think that you can actually put that time to much better use just reading endless books for origin story. That's certainly how I like to imagine you spending your time.
I couldn't think of anything else to do with my life, so that's how I spent it. Listeners can get 60% off an annual Incogni plan by getting your own unique discount code at incogni.com/origin story. Take back your data privacy with Incogni and beat the digital Stasi. So as I said, the SDS never had more than 5,000 members and allies, but it was the biggest left-wing organization in decades, the biggest in terms of its sort of impact and influence. And it destroyed itself at its final convention in Chicago, June 1969. Everything happens in Chicago.
It really does.
First, it's taken over by the Maoist Progressive Labour Party. They take over the leadership. Then the Revolutionary Youth Movement, which is also Maoist, tries to take it back.
Oh, no.
But they're not the same Maoists. Progressive Labour are these doctrinaire killjoys who oppose like long hair and drugs and being freaky, whereas the Revolutionary Youth Movement are more glamorous and countercultural, and they like acid and orgies.
Oh God, this is fucking shot. So this is basically just a really long Monty Python gag. Is that what you're doing right now?
So the Revolutionary Youth Movement calls the Progressive Labour Party false Maoists, and Progressive Labour shouts back, "Read Mao!" After 2 days of arguments and fistfights, the Revolutionary Youth Movement wins the right to rule over the wreckage of the SDS.
Wait, which ones were they again? The freaky ones or the non-freaky?
The freaky ones.
Okay.
Right? So some Revolutionary Youth Movement members, including Mark Rudd and Bernardine Dawn, these radicals, publish a manifesto called "You Don't Need a Weatherman to Know Which Way the Wind Blows."
Uh-oh.
It's a Bob Dylan lyric. It presents revolution in America as part of a global uprising of oppressed minorities. It's led by black people in the white working class, even though most of them are, of course, neither black nor working class.
Right.
And they form an ultra-militant group called the Weathermen. They say things like, "We're bullets in the guns of the third world," and compare themselves to Mao's Red Guards.
If you've just watched One Battle After Another,
Yeah.
that's almost like a sort of parallel reality of the US where the weathermen were very successful.
Yeah.
Like,
Really good at their jobs. I
Yes.
literally had One Battle After Another in my notes.
Oh, right. Yeah.
This is exactly what that is influenced by via the Thomas Pynchon novel Vineland. So in reality, they're just not very good.
are they one of the only terror groups on earth to have ended up killing more of themselves than they have anyone else? Because I think 3 of them die by accident when they're planting a bomb, but they never kill anyone else. So
Yeah,
it's
I think
sort of
they're
3-0.
building a bomb.
Right.
I think it's just like in their apartment.
Okay.
Yeah, they do. They announced a campaign of direct action in October 1969 called the Days of Rage. I mean, they are good phrase makers, these guys.
Yep.
But again, the workers just don't show up. And everyone from the Black Panthers to the Cubans warn them not to get too far ahead of the masses. But they do not listen. A few hundred activists running around smashing windows and chanting "Ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh" before being arrested. Then afterwards, the hardcore, which is the Weathermen, abolish the SDS altogether, and then they go underground where they engage in some rather inept terrorism.
Right.
One Weatherman recalled, "We actually believed there was going to be a revolution. We really thought that would happen." Which is weird now, because it obviously wasn't going to happen. If you look, there was nothing to justify that. And yet it was very, very popular, that belief. And you can hear it in pop music. So in summer 1969, the UK #1 single for 3 weeks is "Something in the Air" by Thunderclap Newman, produced by Pete Townsend, which has the line, "Hand out the guns and ammo because we're going to blast our way through here. This is the revolution's here." This is like the summer #1, the sound of the summer.
It's incredible.
Pete Townsend then gets asked by some radical, actually, to the Who need to write an anthem for the revolution. And he writes, "Won't Get Fooled Again," which is like an anti-revolutionary anthem. already, just within a few months of working on that other record, he's just like, oh yeah, no, actually, this isn't going to work. This is the time that Tom Wolfe coins the term radical chic after attending Leonard Bernstein's fundraising party for the Black Panthers. This idea that a lot of celebrities were just getting a kick out of being around revolutionaries. I mean, Tom Wolfe, obviously a very conservative writer and a rather bitchy one, but not wrong to identify something there, a certain frisson that the rich were getting. Most famously, John Lennon had a radical phase. So, you know the Beatles song Revolution?
Yeah.
So he denounced violent revolution. This is in 1968. If you go carrying pictures of Chairman Mao, you ain't going to make it with anyone anyhow. Thing is that you're not going to get laid if you've got Chairman Mao on you.
I mean, that seems like quite a definitive argument.
But early 1971, he's telling Tariq Ali, I really thought that love would save us all, but now I'm wearing a Chairman Mao badge. I'm just beginning to think he's doing a good job.
Oh, wow. Fuck. Okay.
And in Power to the People, he completely repudiates the earlier song and sings, say you want a revolution, we better get on right away. This is like 71. I mean, it's really not happening.
Yeah.
And yet the revolution will be televised again around this time, which appears in One Battle After Another as well, doesn't it?
There's always this sort of sense of sort of, you know, books and music around this time of people almost trying to work out when the high watermark. Well, actually, you know, Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, there's a whole sort of moment where he talks about where was the high watermark. You know, it's like you can almost see it, you know, the point where the spirits raised and then started to recede again. There's almost like a sort of like subgenre of trying to assess that high watermark.
Because, of course, actually a lot of what we remember about the counterculture, you know, is not about imminent revolution. You know, I haven't even mentioned like Woodstock. If we were doing something here about the 60s counterculture, there's loads of things that I would have mentioned.
Yeah.
And there were political ideas, of course, expressed at Woodstock and protest, but it wasn't part of this, the New Left, as a political movement. That was more a kind of vibe that was permeating wider society. So you get the similar process in Europe. The authorities crack down on protests, so the mainstream movement dies and the ultra-militants turn to terrorism. So Germany's Red Army faction, aka the Baader-Meinhof gang, here's Ulrike Meinhof again, kill 34 people during the 70s and 80s with bombs and assassinations, and the Red Brigades in Italy kill nearly 50. Fewer than you'd think, considering how long they were going and how many different actions there were. But they were really, I mean, some of them, some of the assassinations and the kidnappings and the bombings, incredibly high profile.
Well, and also just how famous they are.
Yeah.
These are names that people know, and they, you know, would be sort of uttered in the same, maybe not quite the same breath as something like the IRA or something, but, you know, but it's interesting how numerically you really are talking about very, very low numbers over a very, very long period of time.
Well, they became like kind of sexy countercultural celebrities, like kind of rock stars. In fact, there's a fascinating example of Commune 1 in West Berlin, which I honestly recommend people just, if only you read the Wikipedia page, it's just so interesting. So they start out in 1967, like the Yippies, they're called self-styled fun gorillas. And then it becomes this sort of hot spot, you know, guests like Jimi Hendrix dropping in. Then it falls apart. Of the two founders, one of them joins a sex commune and the other one becomes a terrorist. I mean, that's the 60s right there.
I think the first one had a more sensible approach towards the whole thing.
Although apparently he objected to it being called a sex commune. He goes, it's just a commune with a lot of women and I'm the only guy and we have a lot of sex.
Okay, I see. All right. So it's a cult. All right.
So even the militants who aren't blowing things up are joyless and cult-like. So the Maoists emulate China's struggle sessions and public humiliations, which I talked about in part 1, which inevitably drives some members to crack up. You know, this relentless kind of criticism sessions where nothing should be suppressed. Anything you're unhappy about, you should just vent.
Oh, wow.
Which is a very difficult way to live. Italian Maoists had to sell their bourgeois books, record players, mopeds and toasters to raise money for the cause. No toast for you.
Toasters?
Yeah. They policed sexual relationships, bullying and abuse were legitimized. One American ex-Maoist said, some people's lives were torn apart. They were cast out of their groups. There were some suicides and definitely I think it's too much alliteration here, deep, deep demoralization, disillusionment and despair.
This is just like Twitter before Elon Musk took over.
It's a bit like that. It definitely, this is a period when you see the worst of the left. The Scottish New Left Review writer, Tom Nairn, had a good theory of this. He says, this is what happens when you have no power in the wider world. We talked about how this was the case in sort of like 1903, 1904 with the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. They basically had no power. So they devoted all their time to like arguing about ideas. They turned all that kind of like aggression in on themselves. He says here, where ideas are all, the upholder of a contrary thesis becomes automatically an enemy. Antagonism becomes hatred, and polemic is turned into degenerate abuse. Now, isn't that something that keeps happening on the left?
Yeah.
You don't have any power. You're not affecting anything. And so therefore, you're just going to rip someone a new asshole on blue sky for having a slightly different criticism of the government than you have.
Yeah, or attack someone from the student union because they haven't stopped, someone from reform coming to speak, or exactly, it's that small microcosm of the struggle to which you dedicate a tremendous amount of energy.
Or, you support Palestinians, but you don't support Hamas, or, just these tiny, we say the narcissism of small differences, but I think that's sort of the point. It's just like, well, you're not actually landing any blows on the powers that be, so you just land blows on each other, which goes back to Lenin and goes back to Marx.
Yeah, Marx versus Bakunin. Yeah. We can keep on going back we can go to the Saint-Simonians, versus Fourier. This is the story that we have been telling.
And this is where the phrase political correctness in its original meaning originates. This is from Mao. The correctness or incorrectness of the ideological and political line decides everything. So it originally becomes, this is not politically correct as a criticism, and then it became like an in-joke among the left, like that's not very politically correct. And eventually it makes its way into the mainstream. So on the one hand, there are these various Maoists and Trotskyists who keep splitting into new groups that then split again. And this is where people will always bring this up as if they're I don't mind you bringing it up, but on online when people bring it up like it's they're the first people to notice it and go, people's front of view dear. Which of course, that's a direct response to that. That's what that's describing. So in America in the 70s, there were about 50 different Maoist groups. I mean, I don't know how many members they had. 3.
Right.
In the UK, numerous Trotskyist groups. Just to give you an idea, right?
Yeah.
The International Socialists, now the Socialist Workers' Party, the Workers' Revolutionary Party, Workers' Power, the International Marxist Group, the Revolutionary Socialist League, which became Militant Tendency, the Revolutionary Communist Party, Workers' Fight, Big Flame, the Spartacist League, the Socialist Organizer Alliance, Socialist Action, and on and on and on.
Oh my God.
Now, with those, only the SWP and Militant had any success, and they never had more than a few thousand members. I mean, that made them the kind of like the fucking juggernauts of the scene. But ex-Trotskyists included Christopher and Peter Hitchens, former Labour Chancellor Alistair Darling, and Keir Starmer. Well, I'm not quite sure how committed he was to the cause. Knowing a bit more about him now, I don't know if he was ever a real Trotskyist.
No, maybe he's still following an entryist agenda. He's really fucking gone deep there.
But he was we came across a Pabloite Trotskyist.
Yes, that's right.
And I, at the time I was like, whatever, But Pablo was actually helping in the Algerian War of Independence. He was helping build bombs. So Pabloite Trotskyists had quite a hardcore heritage. So that's perhaps explains the Labour government of today. So the Trotskyists, though, they're still obsessed with class struggle, and they have a blind spot for things like race, gender, sexuality. The mainstream Marxists call feminism bourgeois.
We did cover this in the Marxism episode, right? It was just like it doesn't have the language. If you're in the proper orthodox Marxist mold, it doesn't have the language for that. Power is economic. Economics explains how history operates, and all these other forms of identities that matter to people, or that people are murdered on the basis of, or oppressed on the basis of. It just doesn't have the language for any of that stuff. And the moment that it does have the language for it, the moment you get people around Marxism who are like, no, you know what? If we modify the theory like this, we can do it. It loses all of its predictive power.
Yeah.
So there's a real loss. Once you start bringing in these ideas into the theory, it's always been a mess.
At one point, Militant Tendency claims that homosexuality would disappear under socialism.
Oh, fuck.
Which I don't think is how homosexuality works.
No, really.
So other forms of socialism spring up around them. You know, the Trotskyists and the Maoists, they're part of the new left, but they're kind of not really in the mainstream of what the most influential strain of the new left. So it's first in the US and then almost immediately in the UK. It's literally the US 1969, the UK by 1970. Stonewall Riot, 1969, leads to the gay rights movement, the gay liberation movement. Eco-socialists or red greens, they fuse environmentalism with social justice and grassroots democracy. The German Green Party comes out of the New Left. The Black Panthers fall apart, but there are other forms of kind of black activism. They become far more visible in movies, on television, in politics. Think of kind of like black art, American art in the 70s. The films, the TV shows, the music.
Yeah, my God, yeah.
You know, far more visible than in the 60s, even though as a, you know, and indeed black politicians getting elected. So that kind of revolutionary moment has passed. But
like blaxploitation cinema and things like this. Okay, that's fascinating, yeah.
And feminism. So a little bit on feminist socialism. There were always feminist socialists. You go back to Robert Owen, Charles Fourier, again. So much Fourier in this episode.
We really should have given him more time in that verse because he has fucking earned it, man.
Yeah.
He's had footsteps all the way through this stuff.
He just got kind of squeezed out and they're like, it's all about economics, mate. It's the economy stupid, as Marx famously said. And
it turns out he's always in the side, just being like, it's about shagging. Can't you see this?
It's about good food, ladies. So the feminist aspects of Marxism obviously held back because it's a distraction from the class struggle, right? So Engels, who did care about women's issues, but he thought socialism would automatically liberate women.
Yeah.
And then writers like Simone de Beauvoir said that economic change would not be enough. It was perhaps necessary to enable the liberation of women, but would not achieve it in itself. Obviously correct. So in the 60s, the New Left's focus on, like I said, this participatory grassroots democracy challenging the traditional hierarchies ran up against its sexism, a new word that appears in this period, and the domination by men.
Sorry, that I had no idea. That word just the word sexism only comes up
in its kind of modern sense, yeah. Because you'll probably notice that with a few exceptions, like Bernardine Dawn and Ulrike Meinhof, and most of the people I've mentioned are men.
Right.
Most of the student leaders and so on. The women in the movements noticed this as well and got pretty radicalized by this. And they didn't want to just fight for like equal pay and economic issues. They wanted to fight misogyny and sexual violence and terrible sexists in the movement. There were some proper misogynists in the New Left. And they were more interested in lived experience than doctrine.
Right.
So not all feminists were socialists, but they were very intertwined in this particular moment. The New Left version of feminism begins again in 1968 with a very famous protest at the Miss America pageant, where women dumped bras and girdles into a dustbin that they called the Freedom Trash Can. And because of, people didn't want to go to Vietnam, were burning their draft cards, this was misreported as burning bras.
Oh, shit. There never was a burning bra.
No, they were just like putting them in this trash can, but it got misreported as bra burning, and you still hear the word bra burning.
Yeah, 100%.
Now, right? They were not burning the bras. The organizers were Carol Hanisch and Robin Morgan, who both went on to publish these landmark essays, which I've linked to in the show notes. Hanisch wrote one called The Personal is Political. Good phrase, caught on. And Morgan wrote a thrilling manifesto called Goodbye to All That, which takes down the entire male New Left and this idea that socialism will automatically liberate women. It is quite short. It's amazing. Just to quote kind of two bits which really kind of sum up the point. To hell with the simplistic notion that automatic freedom for women or non-white peoples will come about, zap, with the advent of a socialist revolution. Bullshit. Two evils predate capitalism and clearly have been able to survive and post-date socialism, sexism, and racism.
Yeah.
She ends it like this. Goodbye forever, counterfeit left, counter left, male-dominated, cracked glass mirror reflection of the American nightmare. Women are the real left. It's fucking full on. But feminism does run into the same old problems of factionalism. This split between the kind of so-called the radicals and the so-called politicos that have got, I suppose, more pragmatic aims. And all these questions, should they ally with political parties? Should they include male allies? Should feminists even date men? Should they be united or have different groups based on class and race? Should it be socialist or not? Which is not to downplay any of the tremendous achievements of this wave of feminism, but just in the context of what we're talking about, even when they got rid of the men, they did encounter a lot of these same factional issues.
Well, these are not male issues. The question of compromise, which, comes up in pretty much any movement you see and will divide any set of people trying to achieve a political aim, is, not dependent on your identity. It's just a different mentality as to how you secure success.
But obviously there is this excitement of like, oh my God, these male-dominated movements aren't working.
Yeah.
We'll go and, that utopian idea, okay, things will be better now. It does get nasty. Robin Morgan publishes this feminist anthology called Sisterhood is Powerful. And years later, another prominent feminist says bitterly, sisterhood is powerful. It kills, mostly sisters.
Oh.
There were some really, really bitter arguments and a lot of unhappiness from some of these remarkable figures. Jo Freeman, another feminist, describes a toxic habit called trashing. Like a cancer, the attacks spread from those who had reputations to those who were merely strong, from those who were active to those who merely had ideas, from those who stood out as individuals to those who failed to conform rapidly enough to the twists and turns of the changing line. That was in her particular group, not, feminism on the whole. And this is the same thing, right? You could be in a Maoist group and be describing exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But the legacies of these things are here with us today, right? Of feminism, of gay liberation, so on. So there's this three-way splintering of the New Left in the 70s. Some of them go into mainstream politics, like Tom Hayden. Becomes a politician, married Jane Fonda. Some went into terrorism and extremism, and some turned to these new social movements. We're sort of nearing the end of the story. Got to introduce one more big thinker who becomes very influential in the 70s, in this sort of age of fragments, that's known as. How to reconcile all these different groups within socialism. Antonio Gramsci.
He's done it. He's brought him up. He's named him. It's the online left's favourite thinker has come out to play.
Oh yeah, baby. Morbid symptoms. Eric Hobsbawm called him probably the most original communist thinker produced in the 20th century West. Born in Sardinia in 1891, co-founded the Italian Communist Party, arrested by Mussolini's regime in 1926, imprisoned 2 years later. The judge who sentenced him said, "We must stop this brain from thinking." What an incredible fascist line.
That's also one of the most flattering judicial rulings. You'd be like, yes, I've made it.
I've made it. He begins writing the so-called prison notebooks, about 30 books, 3,000 pages. Dies in 1937 at the age of 46, 3 days after his release from prison on the grounds of ill health. I mean, he's ill basically the whole time he's in prison. The notebooks are first published in Italy in 1948 and have a massive influence on post-war communism in Europe. But they're not substantially translated into English until 1971, and they arrive like a gift to the New Left after the disappointments of 1968. This factionalism and fragmentation and setbacks. What are we going to do now? Obviously, I'm not going to sum up all the thinking of Antonio Gramsci.
That's a pity.
Really? How long you got? No. So he's wrestling with the reason he is in jail, which is the Italian socialists. They didn't attempt a revolution when they could have in 1920. And they let the fascists harness that disrupted, disaffected energy instead. So Gramsci blames this passivity on the determinism of mainstream Marxism. Capitalism will fall inevitably. And he thinks this sort of held them back. He argues that capitalism had lost its legitimacy, but socialism hadn't gained it. So that energy had gone to fascism, that void had been filled. His famous line, "The crisis consists precisely in the fact that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear." That's one of the most quoted I guess, political lines I can think of.
It's sort of like socialism's the centre cannot hold.
It is.
It has that same
exactly
sort of cadence. And,
because you can almost apply it to most eras. Can't you?
Exactly.
Morbid symptoms. Now, the fact he was in jail actually helped his writing because he was detached from real communist politics and could work out his own ideas on his own, just digging into history and working. So his originality was a product of his isolation, which is, I might try that.
Yes.
Just get arrested to work on my ideas.
It's the only way you're going to get any peace and quiet around it.
Just make sure you send me to one of the nice prisons with a good library. I'll focus on the most influential ideas. So look, Marx's image of an economic base and a cultural superstructure growing out of that. We covered it in the Marx episode. If you haven't heard that, yeah, it's the idea that the fundamentals is economics and culture is a product of that. And he rejects that and comes up with this different image where there is a trench in front of a fortress. And the trench is political society, which is the government. But the fortress is civil society, which is trade unions, churches, charities, etc. He sort of popularizes the use of the word civil society in this sense. Now, the first one of those, the government, exerts direct domination over its people through coercion. It's got monopoly on the use of force, etc. While the second achieves what he calls hegemony through persuasion and making its values dominant. So hegemony is when you have established a ruling class, not through coercion, but changing people's minds, essentially. This is very crude, sorry. But he thought that before Mussolini came along, the Italian state had lost its persuasive power and therefore it only had its coercive power, and that made it brittle. And I think that's I think that's a really good way of looking at why some dictatorships fall. Why, I could say you look at Trump's America and you could go, it's using the power of political society for all it's worth. But actually the civil society stuff, it doesn't have that hegemony. Doesn't have that kind of thing where the mass of Americans think, yes, this is a good way to be doing things. And that's why it does seem weirdly fragile, even when it's very aggressive and violent. You know, what happens when people don't believe in a country, in a ruling class anymore? And he used the French Revolution as an example of what happens. You transform the whole nation. You don't just change the government, right?
Yeah.
Gramsci defined ideology as much deeper, therefore, than an intellectual project. It's more this unspoken popular belief system that informs people's behavior.
Right. Is that what the parameters of your assumptions?
Exactly that. So hegemony is established once ideology feels like common sense. It no longer feels like ideology. Two great examples of this was the way, Keynesianism in the post-war decades and then neoliberalism from the 80s onwards.
Yeah.
Both of them were hegemonies because it just felt natural. It's like, yeah, of course, this is the way we should do things.
Yeah.
They were, two very different systems, and yet people's common sense changed.
Well, when we were talking about the phrases that annoy us during the live show and I was talking about tax raid, that idea, you've got a whole set of assumptions in that word raid as to where that money legitimately belongs. Is it social? Is it individual? And it's all imbued into your language, your day-to-day chatter. And in fact, when you see so many of the disputes, let's say the dispute over whether we should say undocumented immigrants or illegal immigrants, it's that quite conscious attempt by, sort of politically educated people to try and control the parameters of people's thought. Through language as to how they can conceive of these ideas.
And it's, why people make critiques of, the BBC and their choice of words. And, and how that
Hamas,
informs.
whether it's terrorists or militants. Exactly. Yeah.
So for Gramsci, intellectuals and students have a really crucial role to play, which intellectuals and students love to hear. In basically educating people, because a group cannot simply impose its ideology on other groups. He writes, history and politics cannot be made without passion, without this emotional bond between intellectuals and the people nation. So how do you change society? In Russia in 1917, civil society was very weak. So Lenin could seize the government and then introduce socialism. But in a democracy where you've got a strong civil society, you have to introduce socialism before you gain political power, at least introduce its ideas. So to create what he calls a counter hegemony, you can't wage something like the Russian Revolution. This is this other really important concept. That's called a war of maneuver, where you basically just seize power. You have to wage what he calls a war of position, which is a battle of ideas over time, which is it's also easier. It's harder in some ways, easier in others. Certainly more appealing to people who are completely incapable of mounting a armed revolution.
Yes. And used to living in considerable comfort.
Yeah. So it's patient activism. For that to succeed, therefore, you need to form this broad bloc that goes beyond sectional interests and involves compromises and alliances and so on, like just good politics. And you need to slowly influence the existing institutions or create new ones. So this is very much like Rudi Dutschke's Long March Through the Institutions.
Right,
It is a very, very similar idea, which is why it gets misattributed. But it's not just a left-wing strategy. Steve Bannon cites Gramsci.
Yeah.
That was his thing. If conservatives want to do that all the time, what have conservatives spent decades doing? They influence school boards.
Mm-hmm.
They recruit promising law students, and then they try and get them appointed, later on as judges. It's like, it's a very good analysis, not of just a strategy for the left, but of how successful politics works, which is moving through civil society, right?
Yeah.
And which is why, of course, you get these mad fights over the National Trust.
Yeah.
Because some people believe that there's been this sort of Gramscian war of position by the left to take over the National Trust, which I do not actually think is the case.
No, of course not.
I think they're bonkers. But that's the cultural Marxism conspiracy theory, that the left has infiltrated everything. And Gramsci isn't really saying, like, sneak in like spies. He's just like, if you want to bring about change, you have to look across all of society. That you can't do a Lenin, or I guess a Mao or a Che or whatever. Mm-hmm. He's going, this is how it needs to work.
And this is very much the world that we live in right now.
Yeah.
Like, when we argue about Robbie Gibb at the BBC, this is the argument that we're having right now. Boris Johnson appointments, into the BBC. It's the one, when you talk about trans rights, it's exactly what's been going on in the Equality and Human Rights Commission. It's over and over. It's installing your figures, especially cultural figures, in civic society and the institutional structure around government and around parliament to try and sort of harness the energies to direct the debate in the way that you want it to go. We've been living in this place for at least 10 years in a very vivid way, and obviously much longer than that.
And then it doesn't matter who's in power.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter who's in the government if you've got control of these institutions. And of course, the left always thinks the right controls everything, the right thinks the left controls everything, and so on. And this requires like a very clear sense of what your opponent's strengths are and your own weaknesses. That's where you get this other famous line, I'm a pessimist because of intelligence, but an optimist because of will, which again kind of gets misused. What he's saying is actually like, with the pessimism, he's just going like, you've got to be very clear what you're up against.
It's a great line.
He had some very good lines. And we had a lot of notebooks.
He had a lot of time,
The last key phrase, he uses the term subaltern class, right? Which is the group that is not the ruling group. And he meant peasants, workers, and these other subordinate groups, as you'd imagine, like in the 20s and 30s in Italy, who were excluded from power. And then in the 70s and the 80s, the left takes up this idea of building these broad blocks and expanding the subaltern concept. So it gets used a lot in post-colonial theory. But here it can also take in the struggles of women and ethnic minorities and LGBTQ people.
Right.
And it's essentially that Marcuse's idea of this alliance of outcasts and outsiders. All these ideas are sort of like point in the same direction and show you what the politics of the new left became through the 70s, through the 80s. And to today, when we don't call it, obviously, the new left.
It's just the left.
Yeah, but a lot of figures, they're still influenced by that. John McDonnell,
Yeah, exactly, yeah.
when he was at the GLC, was fascinated by Gramsci and thought this was, and Long March Through the Institutions and all of that.
I mean, this guy would be right now, as you're saying, because it's not just the left, it's Bannon as well. This is one of the most influential sort of intellectual figures on the battles that take place today.
And it's just remarkable that he was able to think in such fresh ways because he was not able to get sucked into factional disagreements and organizational struggles and so on. I mean, there is something to be said for that. He's almost like a pure intellectual, even though he started off very much as like a full-on activist and working in factory councils and setting up the Communist Party. He becomes this kind of intellectual hermit.
And he's also clearly just someone that speaks to a particular period in time. So he clearly speaks very powerfully to ours. He clearly spoke very powerfully in the 1970s.
Yeah.
And evidently there are just these moments where he seems to have a very particular kind of resonance.
Yeah, I mean, of all of these people, that he's the one who just seems as current now as he did in the 70s. Like, people are not talking about Marcuse in the same way. If somebody introduces themselves as a Maoist, you'll run a mile, If somebody says, in fact, going through this whole story, Gramsci and Rosa Luxemburg are the ones where it just seems like they're the Marxist thinkers that still seem to have this popularity and credibility and relevance. And of course, neither of them had any power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is quite crucial, I think, to their sort of moral prestige. So just to wrap up, how do we assess the new left? I'm going to use Gramsci's terms here because it does depend on your criteria. So if you look at it as a war of maneuver, a political movement, like a colossal failure, they didn't achieve revolution. They didn't end the war in Vietnam when they wanted to. I mean, it did end in 1975, but not because of them solely. They didn't get their preferred political candidate selected. In fact, they had a massive right-wing backlash led by Nixon and Reagan. They were wrong about the righteousness of Mao and Ho Chi Minh and Third Worldism. And in the 70s, things happen like China opposes independence for Bangladesh. That was a very brutal sort of conflict. And China was suddenly just like, And they're meant to be supporting everybody's independence. No, thank you. And then the Maoist dictator Pol Pot in Cambodia commits these genocidal atrocities.
Some of the most appalling crimes against humanity of the post-war period.
And sort of, it's very hard by the end of the 70s to think of Maoism as some kind of groovy liberation movement. The students, they never managed to recruit large numbers of workers or the poor. So they basically end up as this vanguard. It's not a mass movement. But it's got no discipline or cohesion. It's like you're a vanguard without any of the benefits of being a vanguard. You're just, you're just a small group of people, basically. On a personal level, the activism was unsustainably intense. It was emotionally grueling. Financially, as you can imagine, quite perilous. Didn't pay very well. And this is such an obvious thing, but I just hadn't really thought about it as such a big problem. Student politics has a really high turnover.
Yeah. Okay. Right.
So people kind of move on quite quickly. And also each new intake looks at the last lot as if just like, who are these old fuckers? Do you remember it was like a fresher? And you might see someone like a first year postgrad and you'd be like, all right, granddad.
Yeah, 100%.
It's just, they seem like such a vast gulf between an 18-year-old and a 22-year-old. So that was creating problems. People were burning out. There were all these sort of splits. A lot of these activists, they ended up very exhausted, bitter, disillusioned. Some great and sad books just about how hard this was on people. And on top of all that, they were infiltrated and harassed by agencies like the FBI. But, similar in Germany and France and so on. But and some writers will try and blame the harassment, but actually there's also the power struggles, the mind games, the schisms.
Right.
It certainly doesn't help if you're being infiltrated and harassed by the state. But there were plenty of problems just within these groups. So this sad irony is that one of the main precepts of the New Left is reject Stalinism. You reject centralization and bureaucracy and a cult of personality. But then you reject them to the degree that your group is so pluralistic and democratic and ideologically fluid that you lose direction and just kind of, or you get hijacked by extremists who do have a plan and a dogma and, a bit of a cult of personality. So it's interesting really what the older leftists thought of them in the Romance of American Communism. which I mentioned before. Vivian Gornick asks some old communists for their take on the new left. One says, it seems to me there's no ideology in the new left. It seems to me theirs is only the politics of despair, not of disciplined action. I don't think they understand world socialism at all, neither its struggle nor its history. It's all too amorphous for me. Sort of true.
Interesting.
Another said, I could not accept the new left as genuinely political. There simply was not politics to me, and it never would be. Without structure and organization, it was gossip. Which is brutal. And of course, you're like, well, how, man? You guys were Stalinists. But you can see kind of how it is possible to just like, to make exactly the opposite kind of mistakes.
Yeah, yeah.
You reject all these bad things, and then new bad things arise. And we'll talk about this at the end of the season, but these problems recur in new left groups new left groups, I suppose you'd say, like Occupy.
Well, this
Same
is
thing.
What you're describing is sort of the undistilled sense of tragedy, which is that you're condemned by your greatest virtue. And that's what you're seeing there.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like it's not by your flaw, it's by your virtue that you are condemned. And that's like the thing that really always sneaks right into your heart.
Because, I mean, obviously you've got some people like the Maoists or the people that kind of valorize Ho Chi Minh who were making actually the same mistakes as the Stalinists, but they didn't quite realize it. And then there's people making the opposite. And it is tragic because you've got these remarkable people, these really kind of quite heroic figures who get torn apart. I mean, there's some real rotters in this story as well. But a lot of the time you've got these people who are, are so idealistic and they're so smart and they've got such grand plans. And they're not just kind of like, dopey fools that don't know what they're dealing with, but just the strain of trying to bring about change when there's just this kind of diffuse, rather chaotic movement. It's a sort of vibe. It's a vibe shift, maybe you would say, more than a political movement.
And yet their concerns and their language and their ideals have, to some extent, become our own, right?
Exactly. So the other Gramscian term is the war of position, the long-term changing of minds. And then you go, oh, it's been a huge success. Because the new left expands the left permanently, I'd say, from class-based politics into a broad coalition.
Yeah.
I mean, it also begins this clash to this day between the more kind of the class struggle socialists and the identity politics, I use that term neutrally, socialists, about whether this is kind of part of the struggle. Is it healthy pluralism, which doesn't leave anybody out, or is it toxic, fragmentation?
Yeah, yeah. Your culture versus economics dispute, blah, 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 which we're seeing mutilate us day by day.
Yeah. It becomes a broad coalition, essentially, the left, of environmentalism, feminism, gay rights, anti-racism. That's not just on the hard left. That's centre-left politics.
Yeah.
Even the SWP, the Trotskyists, they went from really not thinking about racism at all to co-founding Rock Against Racism and the Anti-Nazi League.
Yeah, it's so true.
In the 70s, which is the biggest grassroots movement in Britain since CND. Like, if you've run the Trotskyists around, you are winning the war of maneuver. And even on the level of universities, the student movement does lead to the reform and diversification of education, which again, people are still arguing about. There's still a huge backlash about why do we have gender studies? Why do we have post-colonial studies? But these are products of the new left, which were extremely necessary given what people were studying, in 1962. So in America and the UK, the new left didn't produce new parties, really, but they did elsewhere. I mentioned the German Green Party. Institutions like, the French newspaper Libération is co-founded by Sartre as a response to 1968. There are things around us that are a product of that period. A lot of the terms we use now come from the new left. These are some that seem like they've been around forever, but were sort of popularized during this period. Sexism, political correctness, elite, establishment, Palestinian, black.
If I was to think of, who would be one of my favorite novelists, Paul Auster. Paul Auster clearly massively influenced by 68, as he made clear in his, in 4321, at painful and extravagant length. If I think about, the most important sort of figure in comics that I read, Jack Kirby, the New God stuff from DC Comics that I love is his attempt to process what was going on in 68, over the 60s, politically, into some kind of fantastical sci-fi context. Even in these quite disparate long echoes, you find that you're sort of living in the world that was made by the people who were influenced by these specific events.
I mean, it touches music and movies and television and magazines, because we're talking about quite a long period here.
Yeah.
It's not just the spirit of 68. Like I said, you go back to 1956, and then the story doesn't really end, because what you just get is the fragments and the splintering and the long-term sort of project. So that's one of the challenges, obviously, of doing the story of the New Left. It's like, well, it's not. It was never a coherent political movement.
Right.
So when does it end? But what it is a lot of ideas. And funnily enough, it's the ones that come along later that have the staying power. It's only at the end of the 60s where people are talking more about say feminism and gay rights, environmentalism. These are all late 60s, early 70s kind of movements. And the stuff that would have felt absolutely existentially important in 1967, like a revolution in America, and the teachings of Chairman Mao, not such a kind of legacy there.
Yeah.
That's what I mean about it's two things. One failed, one succeeded. So we will pick up this legacy in the final episode of the season. But yeah, the left today is the product of the New Left.
Yeah, it is. And it feels it. And as you go around telling that story, it's funny. What story, really? Fair play to you for fucking keeping that shit together. Because you started with the death of Stalin, and you're ending with something that feels very, very vivid and now and extremely present. That is it's a relatively short period of time, actually, that you've covered, given how big the cultural gap is between the moment that you start and the moment that you end. It
starts off as just let's not do Stalin, and ends up with this kind of rainbow of different liberation movements.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for listening to Origin Story.
We're getting towards the end of this extremely epic season of socialism. We'll be looking at Che Guevara next, and then we go in for our penultimate and our final episodes covering this story. If you want to support us, it has been, as you may well be able to tell, a massive labor of love from the two of us. So please become a patron, or just, what are they, premium Apple subscribers?
Yes.
Excellent. Yeah, become one of those as well. You'll get sort of free stuff sent to you, our lovely merch-filled new mugs and T-shirts. You'll get money off live shows, good chunk of money off the live shows. We make sure that they get a decent saving each time. And you'll also join our Patreon community online. Oh, and you get every episode 1 week in advance.
You do.
Plus, you get access to the special making of podcast that follows this one, and we'll be following this one in a moment for Patreon subscribers, where we go through the work that we put into the episode and what we recommend you read if you want to look into it a little bit further.
Well, yeah. Thank you for your support. Thank you just for listening. Do tell a friend if you think they'd like it. And shall I do book club for Patreons?
That's what we're going to do next.
Lovely. All right. Stick around, Patreons. For everybody else, bye.
Cheerio, guys.